This section we'll call the emergence of urban America. We call it this because while uh, we had the Industrial Revolution, of course, going on during this time, this leads to inevitably the urbanization of America because people will need to work near these new industrial centers. So it's going to create large urban industrial cities. So American cities in the late 19th century. Uh, Cities grew faster than the West, and because of the industry was located, new industry, the Industrial Revolution was oftentimes located, on the East Coast and along the Great Lakes. Uh, One of the things that allowed for this rapid growth, what we'll call vertical growth, which means upward, north-south, and I don't mean north-south like Earth-wise, geographically wise, but I'm talking about towards the sky. Vertical growth was the invention of elevators. It allowed more people to occupy individual space, like a city block. Let's say a city block, when you just had stairways and wood, you could only go probably 3 stories high as far as office buildings and tenement houses and apartments or whatever. But if you have elevators and also, more importantly, steel, you can go as high as you can imagine because the elevators take you to the top and the steel is strong enough to where it'll hold the structure. So, the steel combined with the invention of the elevator allowed for vertical growth, which allowed for you to have a lot more people in a small space. Also, streetcars and bridges allowed for horizontal growth, meaning you could be farther away from the actual city center and live away from where you were working and be able to commute back in. Now you weren't living too far. They couldn't imagine back then on the commute some of us have today. Like people live in Cleveland or Porter or even Livingston and commute to Humble or Houston every day. That's an hour commute by car. There was no way they would have commuted that far because they didn't have the speed to get there, and it was just too far. But I mean, you could live 5 miles away or however far away, and ride a streetcar in or traverse a bridge in order to go over a body of water, so, which allowed for horizontal growth. Of course, mass transit leads to the middle class beginning to commute. So the new rising middle class of the Industrial Revolution included not the workers, not the laborers, but the middle management in this new economic kind of system we have. You have the ownership of the factories, which the owner usually isn't there, but you have the managers that run the factory, and these managers begin to constitute the new middle class, and they tend to move away from the filth and the crime and the issues of the inner city. The attractions and problems in the cities. Attractions, well, there's jobs there. That's the main attraction for even today. That's the attraction for cities, is oftentimes it's jobs. Also entertainment. There's just more stuff to do in a city than there is in rural areas. And that's, once again, even today, that is an attraction. Problems, though, cramped housing and, public um, not sure what I was going to put there. I'm sitting here recording it, and cramped housing and probably public sanitation issues, because some of these cities were thrown together so fast they didn't have the infrastructure to handle, like things like indoor plumbing to handle all these people, and so you had public health issues, which created a problem. As far as the environment, which kind of ties into that, it was difficult finding a clean water supply, oftentimes because there were no, a lot of people got their water from the river, whatever river or body of water they were near. Of course, there were very little, if any, regulations on refineries and businesses at this time, and oftentimes these businesses would dump their wastewater from the refineries or whatever into the rivers, into the lakes, and this created a very serious health crisis and environmental crisis. Animal and human waste. People rode horses and They had dogs and animals all over the street, and they would just, relieve themselves on the street. And oftentimes there was not enough people there to clean it up, so you just had human and animal waste laying around. People that didn't have indoor toilets, they would just dump their daily waste out the window into the street, and it would just sit there. And of course, it would attract rats and disease and everything else, and so it created a health crisis and environmental crisis. Of course, anytime you have major problems like this, it's the major problems that lead to reform. It leads to people saying, we've got to do something about this. This is not acceptable. And some of the reform movements that came about, especially, most importantly, dealing with human waste, is a flushing toilet system, a sewer system, an underground sewer system to facilitate the flushing toilet system and kind of process out the waste. This graphic and the next one, this map and the next one I'm going to show you, are going to show the distinct increase in the number of larger cities and the increase in size of cities. If you look at the little box there, it says the emergence of cities 1880, the percentage of populations living in cities. And the dark brown are over 60% of that state's population lived in cities. So you're looking at California, where most people live in the San Francisco area. And then, of course, the traditional northeastern states, Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, Massachusetts, these places, they had a large percentage of people living in the city. Actually, that's the second tier, the California and those other ones. The only state it looks like that is over 60% is Massachusetts, which includes Boston. But all those darker brown ones, all those brown ones are at least 40%, but for Massachusetts, over 60% of the city people in those states live in cities. And then, of course, you have Ohio, these emerging states, Wisconsin, Illinois, that had 20 to 39%, and the rest of the states under 20%. Those would be considered rural areas. So, but this was 1880. Now let's take a look at 1920. You can see that these cities, these states that were initially just kind of maybe 40 to 60 or less than 40% are now, many of them, over 60% of the population live in cities. California, even as in the Midwest, like Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, and then you have other farther western states who have upwards of 40 to 60% of their population living in cities, like Seattle, I mean not Seattle, but Washington State, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and even the southern states, the traditionally rural southern states, have upwards of 39% of their population living in the cities. This includes Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Nebraska, Oklahoma. With Texas, of course, having the emergence of Houston and Dallas, and of course Galveston was an important city back then as well. But if you compare the two in just a 30-year period, you can see how we became as a nation, very urbanized, and our population shifted to cities in just a matter of 30 years. Now, the Industrial Revolution also brought with it immigration. And, of course, the one reason they had immigration is because many of the industries advertised in Europe for workers, because with the increased demand worldwide for the things that the United States was making, we didn't have enough workers domestically to fill all the positions. So they began advertising. So you saw a major influx of immigrants into the cities during the late 1800s. And logically, if you are from another country and you move to a different country, let's say you're from Italy and you move to the United States to work, and you land on the shores of New York City or of Boston, the first people you are going to seek out are other Italians, just for safety, security, a comfort level. You want to find people that speak your language. You want to find people that understand your culture. You want to find people that you feel comfortable around. So What would happen is these new immigrants would all kind of live next to each other. They would seek out each other and create their own little communities within each city. So you begin to create immigrant neighborhoods. You would have Irish neighborhoods. You would have German neighborhoods. You would have Italian neighborhoods, and so on. Uh, so these immigrant neighborhoods began to form. Also, the reason some of these immigrants came, many fled famine and hunger. Uh, Many fled political persecution because of their political ideas, or they did not like the political situation in their country. Religious persecution um, oftentimes was a very important one, and ethnic persecution. Based on your ethnicity, you would oftentimes be a target for persecution. And all of them, for whatever reason they came, many of them came for economic reasons, just for an economic opportunity, but they came because of this quote unquote American dream. Word got back to Europe of these successful immigrants who came over and through hard work and ingenuity achieved the American dream. And it's a very strong appeal. It's a very strong pull to these people who are oftentimes living in destitute situations. So, in the first decade of the 20th century, meaning 1900 to 1910, 9 million immigrants made their way to the United States. Historically, immigration had come from Western Europe, France, Spain, and England. That's basically Western Europe in those countries. This new wave, a huge chunk of them, and a majority of them, came from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. Places like Czechoslovakia, places like Italy, and Russia. And one of the problems that arose is that French and Spanish and British immigrants tended to have the same baseline culture as the existing Americans. These people spoke different. These people from Eastern and Southern Europe spoke different languages. They came from Greece. They came from Italy, and they had different cultures. Especially the ones from Russia had different religions: Russian Orthodox, Jews, and it was a difficult accepting them for many Americans, and even Americans that came from immigrant families had a tough time accepting these new Eastern and Southern European immigrants. And in order to facilitate the processing of all of these immigrants, uh, the United States, the federal government created a processing center at Ellis Island off the coast of New York. Ellis Island off the coast of New York. And this place, they just kind of herded people through like cattle. And I'll show you a picture of the interior of Ellis Island here in just a minute. But immigrant life, if you're a new immigrant, you were targeted for exploitation. You don't speak the language. You're fearful. You're kind of under the control of the person you work for, so they can make you basically do anything you want. Because if you don't work, you can't feed your family. So you had to do what your bosses told you, and the bosses knew this, and they would take advantage of you, and they knew you were afraid to go to the police or go to anybody because you just didn't understand how the world worked. And so they were targets for exploitation. Especially women were targets for all kinds of exploitation. Uh, Wage exploitation, sexual exploitation at work. It was kind of a very dangerous environment to live in. Ethnic neighborhoods formed in order to protect each other, and oftentimes older immigrants, those who were second generation immigrants or had been in America for quite a long time, decades, they often moved out because they had become more Americanized and were uncomfortable with these new immigrants who were very, very, not un-American, but very, very native in their ways of their old country. Of course, there is going to be a nativist response always. The new immigrants were viewed as a threat, mainly because their culture and religions were different than traditional cultures and religions that had immigrated in the past. Now, we also had the Irish early on in American history who were Catholic and immigrated, and there was a big backlash at that time in the early 1800s. But now you see more Catholics coming in. You also see more Jews coming in, Russian Orthodox, all kinds of different religions, and this is seen as a threat. Also, the different languages they speak, the different cultures, the different foods, the different ways of dress. This is all scary to people who maybe aren't accustomed to diversity, if you will. And a reaction to one main reaction to these new immigrants, and immigrants came from, of course, Asia. The Chinese, if you remember, for the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, Asian immigrants did a lot of that work. Well, Chinese immigrants continued to come in, and because of their influx, uh, maybe the one and only time that the U.S. government has passed a law focused directly and impacting directly one ethnicity or racial group of immigrants or national group of immigrants was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which basically barred any more Chinese immigrants. Other countries could continue, people in other countries continue to immigrate, but Chinese people could not. And because of the influx of other Asian nations, uh, Angel Island on the Pacific coast was kind of the Ellis Island of the West Coast, processing immigrants as efficiently and quickly as possible. This is just a picture of the inside of Ellis Island, and as you can see, it's almost like a herding cattle, where people are just lined up in these little almost caged areas in some cases, waiting to be processed. And in the processing, they would be, asked questions, find out if they're criminals, find out if they're mentally unstable, find out if they have any diseases. They'd be seen by doctors, and just to make sure. And anybody that's a ne'er-do-well that had a criminal record or was diseased, they would be sent back. Popular culture in the during this time in the cities, the middle and upper class, they enjoyed their leisure time at home. They would entertain at home. Oftentimes, they'd have political speakers come in. Okay, politics was entertainment. If you remember, no, I don't think we talked about it yet, but politics was very popular at this time. I mean, some of the highest voting rates in American history occurred during the late 1800s. So politics and listening to political speeches was considered entertainment. You also had Wild West shows that depicted all the what at least Easterners thought was the wild stuff happening in Oregon and Colorado, and then vaudeville, kind of raunchy, risque kind of shows, different types of plays and dances and things like that, comedy routines, reading books and newspapers that did back then. They didn't have computers, they didn't have television, so they had to find ways to entertain themselves. So people actually read books for entertainment, read the newspapers. With the new immigrants, a saloon culture was kind of created because in many parts of Europe, especially places like Germany and Italy, drinking at a saloon was kind of a social event. It was where people came together, to discuss job prospects, to find out, talk politics, and it was a place for men, and they could meet and just discuss the issues of the day. It had a social importance. Of course, as immigrants, got stuck in a cycle of poverty, and people tried to think about ways to end this poverty cycle. And of course, these are people that are wealthy and established, trying to look at poor people and say, this is why you're poor. One of the things they focused on was the fact that, well, you drink too much because you spend your time in a saloon. And so the backlash to the saloon culture was, of course, another push towards prohibition. Outdoors, city parks in these large cities became very important. Frederick Law Olmsted is important because he was a designer of parks. He was a park architecture, and he designed Central Park in New York City. Other outdoor activities, croquet, which is if you've ever played croquet, I did as a kid, but I just never see any croquet sets anymore. But it's almost like golf with these big, huge balls and these little wooden hammers, and you hit these balls through these wickets. And it was a pretty cool game. But anyway, tennis, riding bicycles. The working poor, what did they do for entertainment? Well, street corner, they would, people that live in these tenements and close to each other in cities, they just meet outside, visit, hang out, play cards, whatever. Also, boxing and baseball were popular sports. Women, working women, they spent their time working, and oftentimes they tried in cities. Of course, there was more things to do for them than for single women in the rural areas. Married women did not have a lot of opportunities. They were stuck at home with kids, oftentimes doing work within the home, sewing and washing and things in order to help make ends meet. Spectator sports, well, basically the top spectator sports of that time are still the top spectator sports of this time, of these days in America: football, basketball, and baseball. Actually, in college football, I can't remember how many, but people actually died playing college football because, didn't have the protective helmets you have today. If any helmets, they were just these thin leather helmets. So people actually, in college football games, actually died playing the game on the field. During this time, you also see the changes in education in America. You see the growth of public education and an attempt to embrace and to get more people, especially immigrants, within the public education system. And, while one goal, of course, to educating people is to make them, enlightened and to make them smarter. But one of the other reasons to do this, at least in the minds of uh, existing Americans, was to more quickly Americanize the immigrants. If you can get young Italian or German or Greek children in the school system with American teachers and other American students, they're more quickly going to assimilate to American values, American mores, the American political system, the American economic system. So it was a way to also prepare the industrial workforce, teach you reading, writing, and math, teach you to follow instructions, and all those things that was the original impetus for the public education system. And it was structured on this idea of A, Americanizing immigrants, and B, preparing a workforce for uh, industrial, the new industrial world. Uh, Most of the growth was in secondary schools, older kids learning to read, write, and do math. Vocational training early on became important. Vocational meaning just kind of hands-on training. Uh, you know, Prior to 1862, prior to the Civil War, most all universities were classic. They taught classical subjects. Were classical universities where you learn Latin, you learn high-level math, calculus, and you read the Greek classics. Well, um, that really, while in the East Coast, when all the elites of the families sent their kids to these colleges, that doesn't help people out west whose main job is farming. And so there was a need for training in more practical areas like farming. And so the Moral Land Grant Act of 1862 provided federal land to multiple states in order to create agricultural and mechanical colleges, A&Ms. So you look at, Texas A&M is a land grant college. I'm not sure if it's a moral land grant college, but later it would be a land grant college for agricultural and mechanical training to help people better uh, learn how to use the land uh, agriculturally and also improve their mechanical skills and come up with new improvements in machinery. Uh, Higher education, increase in college attendance during this time. Women begin to enter higher education at unprecedented rates because traditionally they were allowed to attend secondary schools, but once usually not much after that. So women begin to enter into higher education. Intellectual life during this time, science begins to be respected a lot more. People begin to understand and respect the importance and the value of scientific study and scientific research. Um, Most controversial, probably, and probably that was just the scientific theory that shook the foundations of America, was Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, which basically he goes to the Galapagos Islands, looks at different species and compares them, and comes up with his um, theory of evolution. But really, it's called theory of what is it? Selection. Uh, it's survival of the fittest. It's theory of evolution. Basically, his theory is, and he could prove it through the different species that he found, that animals adapt to their environment in order to survive. So they change physically change over time because their environment requires it. If you want to survive, you have to change. And over, it's not radical change, it's gradual over generation. And so this, was very controversial because it kind of challenged, and of course they applied this. Some people applied this to humans, and it challenged the actual kind of the absolute word of the Bible, and it challenged some religious doctrines, and it created a lot of controversy. It also led to other theories, like social Darwinism. Charles Darwin argued that if an animal cannot adapt and cannot make it in its environment, well, it dies off, and that is beneficial to who's left because it weeds out the weak in the species, and it keeps the strong, and the strong survivors of the species mate and create strong um, children, or strong continue a stronger line in the species. Well, a guy named Herbert Spencer extrapolated this and extended it to humans. And he argued that we should not help the sick, we should not help the feeble-minded, we should not help these people because, as based on Darwin's Origin of the Species, the world is survival of the fittest. And if we artificially interfere in these people's ability to survive in our society, well, we're weakening the species and we're weakening our society. So we should let them die off. Of course, this was very controversial, but a lot of people adhered to this idea of social Darwinism. Usually it was the wealthy people who were successful by whatever means already because they've obviously survived. Uh, but then to counter social Darwinism, a guy named Lester Frank Ward came up with his concept of reform Darwinism. And he said, yes, basically animals in that world of not high level thinking, survival of the fittest is the norm, and it is a logical uh, extension of evolution that the weakest should die off. But he said humans are different because humans are high level thinkers, and humans have compassion, and humans have souls, and we care about our society, and we care about everybody. So while um, the social Darwinists could argue that you know animals, the weakest should die off. Humans, because of our unique capacity to feel compassion, our unique capacity to critically think, that we are not bound by that. That we are bound to help our fellow man, the weaker of us. And of course, they tied in Jesus' teachings of helping the least of us, and but anyway, Reformed Darwinism. Also during this time, John Dewey began to argue for a more progressive education that kind of teaches the whole child, that lets a child kind of learn what he or she is best at instead of like rote memorization and learning and only the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, and allows a kind of more holistic education that became very popular later in the early 20th century. And then during this time also, a new philosophy was labeled. The ideas had been around a long time, but the new philosophy of pragmatism was labeled by William James. Pragmatism is basically logic. The meaning and values of ideas is in their practical consequences. William James, and pragmatism, they reject ideology. They reject, this, conservative ideology, liberal ideology, that, the best policies are liberal, the best policies are conservative. And basically he says, do away with that. Find out what works. It doesn't matter, how you categorize it. The meaning and value of your idea is in the practical consequences. Does it help? Does it hurt? Does it fix the problem? Is it pragmatic? And so pragmatism, and this is kind of my philosophy on life in general, and especially in politics, is that the main thing that gets in the way of us in our modern times, and even back then as well, of modern times of solving problems that we have in our society is ideology. Groups say we can't do that because that's a liberal idea, or we can't do that because that's too conservative an idea. Well, no, it doesn't matter. In my mind, does it work? So pragmatism, William James.